There is a primal mechanism in the human brain, a biological alarm system developed over thousands of years of evolution that is designed to detect predators. It creates that sudden drop in your stomach, the prickling of hair on the back of your neck, and the instinctual urge to freeze when something in your environment feels wrong. But what happens when that predator does not breathe, does not have a pulse, and is made not of flesh and bone, but of cotton, yarn, and fabric? What happens when the threat is something that should be the very definition of innocence? We often look to cinema for our monsters, seeking the thrill of a jump scare or a terrifying creature design. But the truth is often far quieter and infinitely more disturbing. The story we are about to delve into is not a screenplay, and it is not a work of fiction designed to sell tickets. It is a documented case file from the annals of paranormal investigation that challenges our understanding of reality itself. It concerns an object that sits, to this very day, inside a locked wooden box with a sign that reads, "Warning, positively do not open." This is the true story of the Annabelle doll. Welcome to Nocturnal Ledger. To understand the horror of this case, you must first strip away the image that Hollywood has planted in your mind. In the films, the doll is a porcelain nightmare, cracked and menacing, something no sane person would ever allow into their home. That is a visual shorthand for the movies. The reality is far more insidious because the real Annabelle is a Raggedy Ann doll. She is soft. She has bright red yarn hair, a triangular nose, and button eyes. And she is the archetype of childhood comfort. A mass-produced toy sold in department stores across America in the mid-20th century. This mundane appearance is exactly what makes the events of 1970 so terrifying. Evil does not always announce itself with horns and claws. Sometimes it hides inside a smile stitched from thread. The year was 1970, a time of cultural shifting and modern skepticism. Yet, in a small apartment in Hartford, Connecticut, 3 young people were about to confront a force as old as humanity itself. The doll was purchased at a hobby store as a birthday gift for a young woman named Donna. Donna was a nursing student, a person grounded in science and medicine, living with her roommate, Angie, who was also training to be a nurse. These were not superstitious people. They were pragmatic, educated young women preparing for careers in healthcare. When Donna's mother gave her the large Raggedy Ann doll, it was a gesture of maternal affection, a touch of home for her daughter's college apartment. Donna placed the doll on her bed, a colorful decoration in a room filled with textbooks and nursing uniforms. It was just a doll, until it wasn't. The activity began with such subtlety that it was easily dismissed. It started with small positional shifts. Donna would make her bed in the morning, placing the doll in a seated position with its legs straight out and its arms resting at its sides. When she returned from her nursing classes in the evening, the doll would be different. At first, it was just the arms. They would be crossed over the chest, or the legs would be crossed at the ankles. Now, it was the kind of thing you could explain away. Perhaps the mattress shifted, or perhaps she had just forgotten how she left it. The human mind is excellent at rationalizing the impossible because the alternative is too terrifying to consider. But as the days turned into weeks, the movements became impossible to ignore. The doll began to move, not just its limbs, but its location. Donna and Angie would come home to find the doll in a completely different room. Donna would leave it on her bed in the bedroom, lock the door, and leave for the day. Upon returning, she would find the doll sitting on the couch in the living room, its button eyes staring at the front door as if waiting for them. On other occasions, she would find it kneeling on a chair. This detail is particularly chilling because a Raggedy Ann doll has no internal structure, and it is soft stuffing. For the doll to kneel, to maintain an upright posture on its knees without falling over, required a suspension of the laws of physics. It implied a rigidness, or perhaps a presence holding it up from the inside. The atmosphere in the apartment began to change. It wasn't just the doll moving, it was the air itself. A heavy, oppressive feeling began to settle over the rooms. Then came the notes. This is where the case moves from a haunted object story into something more predatory. Donna and Angie began to find pieces of parchment paper scattered around the apartment. On these papers were messages written in a crude, jagged handwriting, like that of a small child struggling with a pencil. The messages were simple and terrifyingly vague. Help us. Help Lou. The discovery of these notes brought a new layer of impossibility to the situation. Donna and Angie did not keep parchment paper in the apartment. They had no idea where the material was coming from. It was as if the entity was manifesting the very paper it wrote on, or bringing it from somewhere else. The phrase "help Lou" was particularly specific. Lou was a friend of theirs, a young man who frequently visited the apartment. Lou had never liked the doll. From the moment he saw it, he felt a visceral repulsion. He told Donna to get rid of it, calling it evil, a word that seemed dramatic at the time, but would prove to be an understatement. The entity knew Lou's name. It knew he was a threat, or perhaps a target. Despite the escalating fear, Donna and Angie tried to find a rationale, or at least a benign supernatural explanation. They did what many people in the 1970s did when faced with the unexplained. They contacted a medium. This was the critical turning point, the moment the trap was sprung. During the seance, the medium went into a trance and made contact with a spirit. The entity claimed to be the spirit of a young girl named Annabelle Higgins. According to the medium, Annabelle Higgins was a 7-year-old child who had died on the property before the apartment complex was built. The spirit communicated that she was lonely. She said she felt comfortable with Donna and Angie because they were kind. She asked for only one thing: permission. She wanted permission to inhabit the doll so she could stay with them and be loved. Donna and Angie, and being compassionate nursing students trained to care for the vulnerable, felt a wave of pity for this lost child. They looked at the doll and saw a vessel for a lonely spirit. In a moment of tragic empathy, they said yes. They granted the spirit permission to inhabit the doll. This is a lesson that paranormal investigators like Ed and Lorraine Warren would later emphasize repeatedly. Never invite anything in. The invitation is the key. By granting permission, Donna and Angie broke the spiritual barrier that protected them. They thought they were comforting a ghost child. In reality, they had just handed the keys to their home to something inhuman. Almost immediately, the activity shifted from mischievous to malevolent. The Annabelle Higgins persona was dropped. The doll was no longer just moving, it was acting out. But the true horror was reserved for Lou. Lou was staying over at the apartment one night. He was a skeptic, a brave young man. But that night, reality broke him. He awoke from a deep sleep in a state of paralysis. He could look around the room, but he could not move a muscle. Looking down toward his feet, he saw the doll. It was not where it should have been. It was slowly gliding up his leg. It moved over his chest. It stopped directly over his neck. As Lou lay there, frozen in terror, the doll began to strangle him. He could feel the soft, fabric hands pressing into his windpipe with the strength of a vice. He gasped for air, his vision swimming, until he finally blacked out. When he woke up the next morning, he was shaken. But he tried to convince himself it was just a vivid nightmare, a trick of the mind known as sleep paralysis. And however, the entity was not done with Lou. The next day, Lou and Angie were in the apartment preparing for a road trip. They were looking over maps in the living room. The apartment was quiet. Suddenly, they heard rustling noises coming from Donna's bedroom. It sounded like someone was moving around in there. Thinking an intruder had broken in, Lou walked toward the bedroom door. He waited for the noise to stop and threw the door open. The room was empty. The window was closed and locked. There was no one there, except for the doll. It was sitting on the floor in the corner, looking seemingly lifeless. As Lou walked toward the doll to inspect it, he was overcome by a sensation he later described as a coldness radiating from behind him. It wasn't a draft, it was a presence. He spun around, but there was no one there. Suddenly, he doubled over in agonizing pain. He grabbed his chest, screaming, and fell to his knees. Angie ran into the room to find Lou clutching his shirt, which was rapidly soaking with blood. They dragged him to the bathroom and tore open his shirt. The sight that greeted them was medically inexplicable. 7 distinct claw marks were etched into his flesh. 3 were vertical, and 4 were horizontal. They were hot, searing wounds, like burns from a branding iron. These were not scratches from a cat or clumsy accident. They were deliberate marks of aggression. And here is the most chilling detail. The scratches healed almost completely within 48 hours. Deep lacerations that should have taken weeks to scar over vanished in 2 days. This was not biological. It was demonic. The attack on Lou shattered the illusion that they were dealing with a lonely ghost child. Ghosts do not inflict physical wounds that burn and vanish. Donna finally realized they were out of their depth. They needed help that went beyond a local medium. They contacted a priest, Father Hegan, who immediately contacted his superior, Father Cook, who in turn contacted the only people capable of handling a case of this magnitude, Ed and Lorraine Warren. Ed Warren was a demonologist, one of only a handful recognized by the Catholic Church at the time who was not a priest. Lorraine Warren was a trance medium. When they arrived at the apartment in Hartford, the atmosphere was thick with dread. They began their investigation not by looking for cold spots or creaking floorboards, but by interrogating the witnesses. And they listened to the story of the seance, the permission, and the attacks. Ed and Lorraine delivered a diagnosis that turned Donna and Angie's blood cold. There was no Annabelle Higgins. There never was. The spirit of the 7-year-old girl was a fabrication, a deceptive mask worn by the entity to manipulate the student's empathy. Spirits of human children do not possess dolls. Human spirits do not have the power to animate inanimate objects or cause physical harm to the living in such a violent manner. The Warrens explained that the doll itself was not possessed. This is a common misconception. Demons do not inhabit objects in the way a hermit crab inhabits a shell. They attached themselves to objects. The doll was a conduit, a focal point used by the entity to manifest in our physical realm. The entity was an inhuman spirit, a demonic force looking for a human host. The doll was just the bait. The permission Donna gave was the opening the demon needed to begin the process of infestation, which would lead to oppression and, finally, full possession of one of the girls. The scratching of Lou was a warning. The entity was strong enough to cause physical harm, which meant it was nearing the final stage of its goal. The Warrens knew they had to act immediately. They called in a priest to perform an exorcism of the apartment, a ritual blessing to drive the evil out of the home. But the doll itself was a radioactive core of spiritual malice. It could not stay there. Ed Warren decided to take the doll with him. He needed to transport it to a safe location where it could be contained. This drive home would become legendary in the archives of paranormal history. Ed told Lorraine to avoid looking at the doll, which was placed in the back seat. He avoided the highway, fearing that if something happened at high speeds, the results would be fatal. This precaution saved their lives. As they drove through the winding back roads of Connecticut, the car began to malfunction. The steering wheel would lock up on sharp curves, the brakes would fail intermittently. The engine would stall for no mechanical reason. The entity was fighting them. It was trying to cause a crash. At one point, the danger became so acute that Ed had to pull over. He exited the car, opened the trunk, and retrieved a vial of holy water. He doused the doll with the sanctified water, making the sign of the cross. The activity ceased instantly. The mechanical failures stopped, and the car functioned perfectly for the rest of the journey. The holy water had bound the entity, but only temporarily. When they arrived at the Warrens' home in Monroe, Connecticut, the nightmare continued. Ed placed the doll in his study, sitting in a chair. Almost immediately, the doll began to levitate. It wouldn't just move. It would rise into the air and fall back down. In the coming weeks, it started appearing in different rooms of the Warrens' house. Ed would lock it in the study, only to find it sitting on his easy chair in the living room. The entity was also bringing friends. A black cat began to materialize in the house, stalking the hallways before dissolving into shadows near the doll. The Warrens could feel the hatred radiating from the object, a deep, a guttural growl that wasn't audible to the ear, but was deafening to the soul. Realizing that the entity was too dangerous to be left exposed, Ed Warren commissioned a special case. This is the case you see in the photographs today. It is made of wood and glass, but the physical materials are secondary to the spiritual barriers. Ed constructed the case with ritualistic prayers and binding spells. The most important element is the binding. The case is not just a box, it is a cage for a demon. A priest was brought in to perform a binding prayer over the case, sealing the entity inside. But even behind glass, the Annabelle doll remains a threat. The sign on the door, "Warning, positively do not open," is not a suggestion. It is a lifeline. There is a story, documented by the Warrens, and of a young couple who visited the Occult Museum years later. The young man, full of bravado and skepticism, began to mock the doll. He tapped on the glass, challenging the entity. He said, "If you can scratch people, scratch me." He laughed at the idea of a doll being dangerous. Ed Warren kicked the man out of the museum immediately, telling him he had made a grave mistake. The couple left on their motorcycle. According to the police report and the testimony of the surviving girlfriend, they were laughing about the incident as they rode away. Minutes later, the young man lost control of the motorcycle. He crashed into a tree and was killed instantly. The girlfriend survived, but was hospitalized for over a year. She later recounted that right before the crash, the mood had shifted, and the laughter had died in their throats. The man who taunted the doll paid the ultimate price. To this day, the doll sits in that case in Connecticut. It is said that the entity is still there, waiting. A priest comes regularly to bless the museum and reinforce the binding prayers. Visitors have reported feeling a sudden wave of nausea when looking at the doll. Others have reported their cameras malfunctioning only when pointed at her case. She does not look like a monster. She looks like a toy you might find in a thrift store, a relic of a simpler time. But she is a reminder that the world contains forces we do not understand, ancient intelligences that view us not as masters of our domain, but as prey. The story of Annabelle challenges the skeptical mind because it is supported by multiple witnesses, physical injuries, and the lifelong testimony of Ed and Lorraine Warren. It asks us to consider that the inanimate objects in our lives may not be as empty as we think. It suggests that evil does not need a grand entrance. It only needs an invitation. As you lay in bed tonight, perhaps you will look at the shadows in the corner of your room a little differently. You might glance at that old toy on the shelf, the one with the button eyes that seem to follow you. You might tell yourself it's just cotton and thread. And you are probably right. But Donna thought the same thing. Lou thought the same thing, until the night the cotton hands tightened around his throat. Reality is a thin veil, and sometimes things tear through from the other side. The Annabelle doll is a tear in that veil that has never been fully stitched shut. It sits there, behind the glass, smiling that red yarn smile, waiting for the next person to make a mistake, waiting for the next invitation. This has been a case file from the Nocturnal Ledger. We document the darkness so you don't have to face it alone. But remember, some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Sleep well, if you can.